Welcome to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast, the show for women who are seeking more fulfillment in life and simply not getting it from their current situation. We focus specifically on careers, but hey, we spend a lot of time in our careers, so making changes here will definitely create an impact in your overall happiness. I'm your host, Simone Morris, and my mission is to empower women to succeed. I believe that in order to powerfully own your career, you must decide and claim that you want to sit in the driver's seat. You must know that you deserve better and be willing to not only do the requisite work, but be willing to go out on a limb to ensure your success. Each episode focuses on profiling a leader who is clearly demonstrating ownership of their career. Join me and my guests as we explore career journeys and bring you actionable strategies to use to get into the driver's seat for your career. Because ultimately, your career is your responsibility. Let's get into the show. Hey everybody, welcome to this week's episode of the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. I am super excited to have with me today Robbie Samuels. And before I tell you a little bit about Robbie, I just want to say this is a series of episodes where I bring male guests onto the podcast to share their career expertise, and it's been really great for me. And the reason I thought Robbie would be really great at this was because I was on his podcast and I had such an amazing time that I said to myself, he must come to the podcast and share his wisdom. So a little bit about Robbie. He's a keynote speaker and relationship-based business strategist that has been recognized by the Harvard Business Review and Life Hacker, and he just does a tremendous amount of things and is a best-selling author as well. Robbie, welcome to the podcast.
Simone, thank you so much for inviting me to be here.
Absolutely. Well, I was reading a bit about your bio, but you tell our listeners a bit about you and what you're currently doing.
Well, gosh, I'm not sure how far back do you want me to start? You want
to? All right. Well, it can be succinct, right?
Yeah. No, so I was working in nonprofit. I left that career 5 years ago. I had been organizing fundraising events and raising about $1 million a year through 25 events a year, doing major gift work. But on the side, I'd been speaking. And so I've been speaking now professionally for over a decade. My topic is about inclusive and strategic networking. Inclusion has been the through line of my work, I think my whole career. And that has morphed now, it's taken a little bit of a turn since this new pandemic, but I was working with associations to help them create more engaging conference experiences with a focus particularly on the year two experience. The fact that most people, the first year is going to be overwhelming and drinking from the fire hose. And so it's good that we have service and support for that cohort around, first timers orientations. But I was doing work around what do you do to support the people who are coming year two so that they come back year three and then become really hooked into the association and start to advocate and bring people in with them. Now that we've taken this turn, I am teaching people how to network in a pandemic, which is to stay in touch consistently, even if you can't do it in person. I am working with organizations on how to make their virtual events more engaging and allow for participant connection. What I'm fearing is that we will bring events online and they will just be a series of talking heads. People don't go to events just for content; they go for connections. In fact, you and I met at an event, so you get that.
I do, and I want to go back. If I can interrupt you for a moment. I want to go back to the comment you made about being passionate about inclusion, since that's something that's super passionate for me too. So tell us where did that come from? Where did that passion, because you said it's a through line for your business and the work that you do?
Well, so I cannot say that I am an introvert. I cannot say that I've ever been called a wallflower, because I am very much an outgoing, gregarious extrovert. But I do know what it feels like to not belong and to wonder whether I fit in and whether I'm welcome. And I know how debilitating that feeling can be, because it's usually in your head. It's usually not as true as you have it, the voice in your head. And I can think back to times in camp, being 10, 12 years old and feeling like I didn't kind of jive with my peers. Now, over my lifetime, I've had a few different revelations. I came out as gay, and then I came out as transgender over the last several decades. So I'm an out queer trans dad, married to a wonderful cis woman, and we are a wonderfully proud queer family with 2 kids. But I guess I never really shook the feeling of belongingness. Like, that's what everyone wants. The way I've conquered that in my coping mechanism is I host things. So if I don't know whether I'll belong somewhere, I'm actually the one convening. And if I'm convening people and I'm hosting, then of course I'm welcome. But I'm also going to do everything I can to make sure everyone else in the room feels that too, and knows how to pay that forward so others feel that. So the core program that I've been teaching, Art of the Schmooze, for the last 10, 12 years is really about giving people those leadership skills so that they can include others. And I actually just got to do a TEDx talk last year in 2019. And the title is Hate Networking, Stop Bageling, and Be the Croissant, which is tied also to the title of my book, Croissants versus Bagels, which is around sort of body language and how I believe that open body language is the key to building your strong network. So I don't know. For me, it's like, I think that oftentimes people kind of opt out of opportunity because they think, well, I don't know if I'll really belong. And I want people to think, well, why don't you just create those opportunities by inviting people in as opposed to wondering whether you belong?
I have so many questions for you. The first thing I thought was, God, I also have to have Robbie on the Inclusion School podcast, because we go at it from a conversation about inclusion for children. So that's a separate topic that I'll come back to. But the other thing I was thinking of are, there's several opportunities. One is, tell our listeners how, like, what was the moment for you that you got into the driver's seat for your career? Like, when did you know, okay, I am taking control, I'm calling the shots for my career?
Well, it's so funny because I had a couple of moments like that. I knew that I wanted to have an impact, and I'm very mission driven as an individual, and so it's no surprise that I then started my life in the world of nonprofit, right? Because it's all mission driven organizations. And I knew that I wanted to run multiple annual events that had an impact on an important mission that I felt tied to. And so that was a moment where I took a stance and I said, that's the kind of job I want. That's the career I want. And I thought I'd have to wait a decade. I mean, I was barely 30, and I was like, well, I know what I want to do, but I'm gonna have to wait a long time. And then I got offered my dream job. So at 30 years old, I became a special events manager for this amazing LGBT civil rights organization, GLAD, which is based in the Boston, Massachusetts, but has an impact nationally. And I was there for a decade. Now, most people leave after 2 years of a role like that because it's total burnout. You're working nonstop hours. Now, I didn't have kids yet, and I wasn't married yet. So there was definitely more time in my day, maybe in some ways. I had another turning point when I think it was 3 years in, my bosses sort of met with me, my boss and her boss, and they said, "You're still here." And I was like, should I not be? Like, what? And they're like, well, we just realized it's 3 years and you're not going anywhere. I'm like, no, I'm not going anywhere. I mean, in my mind, I was going to be like there forever. And they said, well, we need you to step up. And it was a real turning point in me having to figure out, like, how do I do that? I'm used to being told what to do and then executing. And so the decision to move up in my own head as to what was possible became like a journey. And I then became the senior manager of events and donor engagement. They became aware of what I was doing outside of work around engagement. And it was wonderful. I got to build my own portfolio of major donors. I took charge of a team. I was running 25 events a year. And it was a great experience. And then my whole team left. So there was 9 of us in that department, and I was the last one standing with a 10-year history. And my new boss had less than a year in the position, and everyone had come in after him. And that's the moment where it started to be like, maybe I'm not needing to stay here, because of course the mission was still important. I wanted to be a donor for life, but I also knew that the people are a lot of why you like go to your job and love it. But my speaking had taken off by then. I was speaking to nonprofits and boards of directors, and my big deal back then was when a foundation hired me, and I was like, woohoo, it's like, this is it. My wife's support is really what made it possible for me to leave the career to focus on building the business. Now, I had been speaking for a long time at that point, but I didn't really have a business built around it. And so the last 5+ years have been around really building that business and crafting that business. So taking ownership of my career in a very different way.
I love that on so many levels, because you had multiple opportunities. And I think you had to be open to stretching your capabilities, or to embracing the leadership opportunity. And you were ready when the time came, and willing to say yes, to go with it and see where it took you. So I think that's very interesting. I want to circle back to the comment about belonging and what we can do to help others feel included. From a career standpoint, can you talk about things like LinkedIn and what our listeners can do to feel like they belong, especially in this time where there's a lot more virtual things happening and a lot more opportunity for you to show up, show your brand on the LinkedIn platform? So from a career standpoint, can you shed any light or advice, wisdom, etc., on showing up and feeling like you belong on that platform?
Well, I think that this is an interesting moment in time because we're going to look back and we're going to realize that what mattered was how we showed up more than anything else. And so, not just on LinkedIn, but showing up, period. And that might mean using Zoom to host a reunion for friends from college. It might mean talking to your parents more often or your grandparents more often. It might mean, um, you don't see your team anymore on a daily basis, but maybe you decide to host a coffee hour every morning for people to come together. So I think that people need connection now more than ever. They've always needed it, but now more than ever. And so showing up and taking leadership. I mean, I just had a friend who said, I can't sew masks and I can't donate money, but I helped my 78-year-old grandfather get on Zoom. And it took 45 minutes of me being patient before he got it. And she says, that's what I could do. And I was like, that is the leadership for you today. That is the thing you did. And I think, you know, on LinkedIn, it's a very powerful platform. So creating content that helps people, speaks to the moment. I think anything right now that doesn't in some way acknowledge, this crisis is pretty tone deaf. So we have to be very careful to not just put out business as usual, to really think about what else you can offer. It may be a little bit off what you normally talk about. Maybe stress and anxiety are not topics you usually address, but you have something to say. This is an opportunity to say it, to address people where they are. If you are meeting them where they are, then they'll start listening to the rest of what you have to say. If you ignore it, then you're just spamming them and it's not going to help them. So it's like they want to trust. Trust is built over time. And so, if you have the opportunity to live on LinkedIn, like test it out, play around with that on Facebook, get comfortable with being on video. I think this is a new normal. Even if we go back to, I don't want to say it, but when we go back to in-person events, I think we're still going to find more virtual opportunities because of this. And if you ignore it and put your head in the sand, I think you really have missed it. You'll have missed this moment and miss having an impact on people who would really benefit from you showing up.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a solid point. Are you hosting events? Because you said that you like to connect. So are you hosting things virtually, Connection Point? I love the reunion comment that you made. That I thought maybe I will do something like that.
Well, I'll tell you, the reunion comment comes from my wife was planning to get together with friends from college, from grad school. They were planning to do a trip together this year. They hadn't seen each other since our wedding, which is 7 years now. So they're not people who see each other regularly in person. They did all their planning through Facebook private messages until this hit. And then my wife said, well, clearly they weren't going to get on a plane and go anywhere now. She said, hey, who's around tonight? And all of them showed up on Zoom because, no one has plans. And it was great. And it was sort of like, why are we waiting to meet in person? We like each other. Let's continue this. So they're going to continue to talk every month. We have a close circle of friends that are scattered a bit. So we hosted something. We're not going to do that every couple of weeks. Like, I think those social connections are really important. But convening wise, I've also, I guess now it's late. Where are we? We're like late March right now as we're recording this. And 3 weeks ago is when I hosted my my first virtual happy hour. So as soon as like it started to hit the fan and I heard the schools were going to close theoretically for 2 weeks, which I knew was a joke, but you know, that's what they would tell us. That Friday night, I hosted a virtual happy hour and we just spent an hour introducing ourselves. A week later, I did one where I spent the whole time explaining to people how to use some advanced pieces of Zoom, just sort of like showing them what I'm doing. How do you play music through Zoom? How do you do breakout rooms? Just like having fun with it. And then tonight, I'm actually hosting another virtual happy hour where I am actually doing a dress rehearsal for an event that I'm hosting next week where I'm emceeing the welcome reception to a virtual conference. So I want to work out all the kinks. You know, that's going to be hundreds and hundreds of people. So tonight we'll have tens and tens of people, but we'll test out that process tonight. And at the same time, I want to be teaching people. So I hopped on a Zoom call last night and taught there's a national dads organization that I'm a part of. I taught them how to use Zoom features to host their own virtual dad's night out. And I've done some of those things. So I think like if you know something, and so, you know, those of us who are entrepreneurs, we know how to work in this virtual world, maybe a little more than other people do. Like showing up and sharing that and being abundant about our knowledge, that's leadership. And that's what people need right now. And it may not have anything to do with what you're selling, but it will build trust. And people will then want to know, well, what else do you do? How can I help you? And that'll become reciprocal over time. Either maybe not directly, but goodwill will be built.
I love that. And it leads me to a question about resources, because when you were talking about hosting these virtual opportunities, I thought about in-person and hosting. And there's a book called Never Eat Alone, where he talks about sort of hosting dinners or things like that. And so I love because you're bringing that virtually as well. And so as we start to talk about books, are there resources online or otherwise that you feel have been very helpful to you in your career that you can recommend to our listeners, excuse me?
Yeah. So, I mean, gosh, there's so many books. It's hard to know which to name. I will recommend anything that Dory Clark has ever written. Dory Clark has 3 great books out. The latest is called Entrepreneurial You, which is where she interviewed people who use different methods to build revenue in their business. And so there's like 50 different ideas in there, and you can then know exactly which expert to go to get more detail. She's brilliant in that way. She was kind enough to interview me for her second book, which is called Stand Out: How to Find Your Breakthrough Idea and Build a Following Around It. A great book for people who are thinking about building their career, because standing out, even if you're working in a company, is really important because, you know, when decisions get made about who's being laid off, if you're the person who runs the softball, you know, team and the annual picnic, you're not going to get, you know, quickly cut out of the picture, you know. So standing out maybe, you know, being the social glue, and it might be for what you do professionally that you bring to the organization. So her stuff's really great. A book that no one probably has heard of is a book called Community: The Structure of Belonging by a guy named Peter Block. He's written quite a number of books in the consulting space. But what I loved about that book was that it talks about how to use space, and the idea that you don't use the space how it was left the night before by the janitorial service. You know, that when you walk in a room, really think about what your purpose is in being in that room, and then set the room up for that purpose. And I will just pair that with the concept of usability versus accessibility. So sometimes, you know, accessibility is sort of a nice idea, but then if you have a stage and you have a speaker who couldn't get on the stage because they can't use the stairs, well, then nobody uses that stage. You just reconfigure the room to be usable by everybody. Or if there's a pole in the middle of the room, you have to address the fact that some people are not going to be able to see, and rearrange your space so that more people have access and can use the space. So it's like really being thoughtful. I can't tell you how many times I've walked to a conference breakout that's 25 people or less in it, and everyone's sitting in classroom style. And I'm like, can we make a circle? You know, it's like they would never have dared move those chairs. And I'm like, come on, let's make a circle and let's make it into a conversation. And I'm like that when I'm the participant. You can just imagine what I'm like when I'm a speaker. But I'm just like, this is what we're here to do. We're here to connect. And so those are the kinds of things that really influence me. And in particular with that book Community, there's a comment that was made to me by a politician who's the one who suggested the book to me. He was saying that the power of convening was his superpower because he's a politician. So when he says, hey, everybody, let's meet here, people show up. And I realized that's my superpower, like my ability to convene people. And it's a superpower that anyone can really cultivate. And it makes you just feel wonderful to be able to offer something while also getting a lot in return.
Now, how did you discover your superpower?
Well, I actually think when he said it out loud, when he said that about himself, I was like, I think that's mine too, except I don't need to be a politician to do it, which is great because I didn't really want to be stuck in that system. But I think that I've been thinking a lot, actually, Simone, lately about how there are influencers and there are connectors. We talk a lot about those two types of people, but I think there's a third group, and that is what either I would call conveners or hosts, right? I mean, by hosts, I mean like they are hosting a space. Convener, they're pulling people together. And a few people I can think of are all three of them. I mean, actually, Dora Clark's a great example. She's an influencer. She is a connector. She's great at making introductions into her network, but she also regularly convenes people through private dinners, through her Facebook group, through the events that she hosts. And so you don't need to be a connector or an influencer to be the host. It's a thing that any of us can do on any scale. So like right now, you can't hang out with your neighbors, but you could find a way to all get in your front yard and have a conversation, with all the physical distancing that's needed. You can do it over electronic means like Zoom or Skype or Facebook video chat. You can host people and bring people together and make them feel better and connected. And once that happens, they often start sharing resources. So a little a little side project my wife and I have been doing, which you probably wouldn't have come across in your research. My wife and I have been running a baby and toddler clothing swap for 4 years.
Cool.
So it started, the group started before my son was born, my 4-year-old. But the first time we hosted an in-person swap was when he was 5 weeks old. So just take a moment and think about hosting something when you have a 5-week-old. We've been doing it for over 4 years, and it's over 7,000. It's closing in on 7,500 families in this Facebook group. And with this new crisis, these people are already connected. And so they're just abundantly sharing and supporting each other, and in lots of ways. It's tremendous to see. And I don't have to really do much. I sit back and moderate, but I don't have to like initiate it as much because they're taking the lead. And if I hadn't created that space, those connections wouldn't be happening. So convening is something we can do on little and big ways.
Awesome. I wonder if you can talk to us about risk, because there have been several examples where you have to embrace risk or have an appetite to take a risk on your career. What advice do you have around being willing to take a risk in your career?
Well, I am of the mindset that before you quit your day job, you should build up your side hustle first. I know what it is. I know that it's viable. And the advice I got was actually from Dory, which and she comes up in a lot of my conversations. This is not unusual. But her advice was, at some point you'll know that it's time to quit your day job because it's getting in the way of your business. And let that happen, like grow to a point. But I also think risk sometimes is speaking up. Risk is sharing the vulnerabilities that you face. Speaking up is naming what's happening that no one seems to want to name. And all those risks are rewarded in different ways. Because sometimes you say things and that space is no longer welcoming you. That's actually better for you to know. And then you go find a place where you do fit and where you do belong, where people appreciate your honesty, your vulnerability, your willingness to speak out. So I think risk is part of owning your career, in as much as being clear on something and that you want it is risky, because then it could not happen and you could risk not getting it. It's much, much less risky to have no goals. If you have no goals, you don't really have any risk. There's nothing to lose. So I think anytime you put a line in the sand and say, this is what I want. I mean, I decided I wanted a TEDx. I didn't want it. And then I hired a business coach, and then they were like, you should really go for this. And I was like, and I went for it. And I was like, well, now I'm taking the risk of it not happening because now I really, really want to do it. Right. So risk is investment in yourself and in your ideas and in your, and having the motivation and pride to do that work that gets you to, closer to attaining those goals.
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I love that you circled back to corporate, because it's not just about deciding to step out into your side hustle, but also when you're in the organization, being open to different things. I remember for a while, I wasn't open to things like working in a different location because I was comfortable being in my family space, staying in Connecticut and not branching out. So I think as you are, as opportunities come your way, you have to weigh whether you go for that opportunity or not, the risk involved with that.
No, absolutely. I mean, having a deep desire is in itself, I guess, part of the risk. Um, but I also think, I guess, having the people around you that support you is a way to mediate that risk. Um, Finding the right sounding boards, the people who will give you advice but aren't really tied to the outcome. I think this is why it's so helpful to have a coach, have an executive coach, a business coach, life coach. Um, if none of those things work for you, a therapist would be great, because having a third party who has their own expertise around strategy or goal setting, or just how to overcome obstacles, having that expertise plus the fact that they aren't actually tied personally to the outcome. Like if you don't take their advice, that's just on you. Like, you know what I mean? It doesn't affect them in any way. They give you what you can use, and then it's up to you to do it. I think this moment in time with the coronavirus and everyone being so scared of COVID-19, I actually think the business of coaching should really see a boom, because basically all the plans we made for 2020 in January, the universe laughed. Like so if we want to come through this year and come out stronger for it, I think finding those third-party experts to guide us and support us, in addition to having a strong community, family and friends who get what you're about. But I just think they're invested more in the outcome, and they can't give you advice that is as, honest maybe. And, they're kind of tied to what they know of you, and they have expectations, or they think about your limitations differently than you might think for yourself. But you hire a coach or a therapist to kind of work on this with you, and I think that's where we'll start to see more results. So and I am saying that as a coach. Like, I'm a coach, and I do work with entrepreneurial women who are in their late 40s and beyond, and that's my ideal client, and it has been for a long time. But I can imagine now it's even more important that the folks that are thinking about making a shift in their life in that way have the supports that they need.
Yeah, I want to build on what you're saying, Robbie, because you went to sort of the key partnerships. As I think about career success, partnerships are key, and I love that you went into the coaches, therapists, etc. Talk to us about your formula for owning your career. You've been on the inside of the organization, externally working as an entrepreneur. What is your personal formula for owning your career?
I think it's about saying yes to opportunities. I think it's about building your opportunities. And I guess the thing that I think I did that a lot of people couldn't understand was I stayed in an organization for a decade. And a lot of folks bounce around these days. And particularly, I stayed in my 30s. My entire 30s, I stayed in one organization. And that was fairly unusual. People would say, well, how did you do that? And I was like, it's pretty easy. You don't leave. Like,
But
like
you said it was your dream job before, right?
yeah, it was a dream job, and it evolved, and I had to evolve with it. And I think, it was a moment in time where it was like, oh gosh, do I want to evolve in this way? But I think, grass always looks greener somewhere else if you look for it. But I didn't. I wasn't looking, and I wasn't making myself available, and I was staying focused. and I was learning and I was growing. And as long as I was learning and growing and felt like I was giving back, I was going to stay. And I feel that same way now with my business. It's like, this is a thing I'm committed to. I've hosted a podcast nearly 4 years. This is not, people are like, well, oh my gosh, how do you still have a podcast all these years later? I'm like, you do it. You commit to it. You have a day of the week that it comes out. You just do it. You build your life around it. I just think like in some ways, my formula for success have been look for the opportunities and then commit to the strategy. The other thing I will say that has helped me a lot, I've taught this to other people, but just crystallized it for me, is that I really believe in quarterly goal setting. And so we make these like annual plans and we have no sense of whether we're making progress. And then suddenly it's the last quarter and we start to scramble to finish something. The last quarter is the worst time of year to try to finish things because it's only really half the quarter. I mean, realistically, we get about 6 weeks out of 12 between coming back from, the breaks. And then it's like, you got the holidays and there's just not a lot that can get done in that time period. So by working in quarters, I'm setting my goals up where I'm like working to completion on one, and then the next goal is the next quarter, and I'm building and building. And if I don't meet a goal, like there was this one time I was trying to launch the next iteration of a coaching program, I put all my effort in for that 12 weeks, and when it didn't work out, I had to reassess. But if I hadn't said it that way, I think I would have just sort of like half-heartedly worked at it and then thought, well, I just didn't work hard enough. That's why it didn't work. But truthfully, I had to rebrand. And once I rebranded, it all worked out. But if I hadn't had that as a guidepost, like, okay, you know what? You had this time period, you worked on it. Let's really look at this, what's going on. So I think for your career, setting quarterly goals could be part of it. Like, what do you want to learn this quarter? What do you want to master this quarter? What do you want to offer this quarter? There's just so many ways to think about that. It could be really helpful.
Yeah, even the season we're in, what do I want to master in this season? Because there is an opportunity to truly invest in yourself and your development during this chaotic time.
Yeah, I had a client the other day who said it's kind of exciting. And it was in response to us talking about him postponing his event by a year, an event that he's been working on for 2 years. And I really was like, wow, that's profound that this is how he's thinking about this. I was so worried for him as things started getting canceled. I was like, oh no, he's this event coming up this fall. Do I have to be the one who breaks the news to him that this is not probably going to happen? It's unlikely. People are going to want to get on a plane, all that. And we brainstormed what could he do if he postponed it and what could he use the time to do. And he got so many great ideas that he's excited now about the new opportunities, the new gaps that he's noticing that he could now fill in his own way with his own leadership through his organization that will strengthen his industry, his sector, and then will also mean that his organization will be even better positioned to host this event a year later, right? So what a positive spin instead of, he could have just been like, oh my God, I've been working this forever and I can't believe it's not going to happen. Woe is me. Boom, he just kind of was like, wow, if I focus on the event, I won't be able to do these other things that people really need right now, and I won't be able to serve them. And I was like, that's true. He's like, oh, this is kind of exciting. And I was like, wow, that's a different way of looking at this world that we're currently in. And I think we all have the opportunity to shift our mindset and look for the gaps that we can now serve and help and support in that maybe weren't there, that got unlocked because of everything that's happening around us. And that's true whether your business is intact after this mess or your business is failing and you have to rejigger it and come up with a new plan, pivot that's major. You can still look for the gaps and see how you can serve.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point that you're saying, and it supports the partnership conversation that we previously had around partnering with a coach, because you ask the right question and it causes your client to think and then look at different perspectives. So it's just a beautiful pairing.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Well, as we begin to wrap up, this has been certainly great. One last question I want to ask about the book title and how you came up with the name Croissants and Bagels. And it's such an interesting title.
Simone, I'm glad you circled back to that because I wouldn't want to leave people wondering. So at events, people tend to stand in these tight clusters of people, that are impossible to break into. You walk in a room, you don't know where to go because everyone's sort of clustered together in these shoulder-to-shoulder huddles. Those circles are the bagels. And if someone in that space shifts their body language to be more open, it invites others to join this space. That is the croissant. And it's really about tying your mindset, right? The reason people leave their house is to meet people. We cannot ever say that we get on a plane to go to a conference just for content, because we can clearly get a lot of great content from home. And so going is not just about content, it's about great connections, the possibility of great connections. But having open body language is sort of you recognizing that you are here to meet people. And then it creates more opportunity for that to happen. And now, of course, we have to find ways, innovative and creative ways, to bring that same engaging openness to the online virtual space of events, which is some of the things I've been really testing out around how do we use technology to allow people to connect with each other. I'm part of 2 virtual conferences that are happening next week that were all supposed to be in person, but now they're going to be virtual, and we are finding ways to still make it possible for people to meet each other and not just have it be a series of like interviews and talking heads. And I think we have to move away from the summit model that we've had of just like one person for another talking, and create opportunities for engagement and networking, because that's why people go to events. It's not just for content, and we need the connections these days.
I love it because it just weaves nicely into what you've been saying all along in this interview. So thank you so much. And we do have that in common, because I talk about inclusive networking, and I don't call it those names, but the same thought occurs to me about that formidable circle there that's shouting exclusion unintentionally. And I have tested it by walking around as a speaker and not identifying myself as a speaker, and test to see if I can break into spaces. So it truly is an interesting concept.
That's great. Yeah, no, I think when you and I met, you were like, yeah, I do something like this. And you started describing it. And I was like, yeah, that's awesome. I've written a book about that. Like, we're going to have lots to talk about.
Exactly. All right. Well, Robbie, it's been fantastic to have you on the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. So many great insights that you've shared and things that you've given our listeners to think about. Please tell our listeners how they can connect with you if they'd like to do so.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to give them all an article I wrote called 9 Ways to Network in a Pandemic. 9 Ways to Network in a Pandemic. So they'll find that at robbiesamuels.com/owning. And then robbiesamuels.com is also my website. And from there, you'll find my book, Croissants versus Bagels. You'll find my podcast, On the Schmooze. And you'll find my TEDx, which is also on there. I mean, basically my home base. You'll also find all my social links. I would love for people to connect with me on LinkedIn, et cetera. So please go check all that out. Download the 9 ways to network in a pandemic. And hopefully you can use some of those to continue building your own career.
All right. Thanks so much, Robbie.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. It is my hope that you enjoyed today's episode. You can check out the show notes for this episode on the SimoneMorrisEnterprises.org website by clicking the podcast menu. Be sure to subscribe on iTunes and tell a friend or 2 about it.